The Russian Revolution of 1917 produced the ideological foundations of the Cold War. Lenin's revolutionary rhetoric of anti-imperialism inspired the poor and colonized to adopt communism. To combat the growing zeal of international communism, Wilson declared his 14 points, which offered hopes of independence to the rising Third World nationalists. In 1918, Wilson agreed to intervene in the Russian Civil War by supporting the anti-Bolshevik White Movement. This would alienate future U.S.-Soviet relations severely. Meanwhile, in America, fears of communist subversion created a sense of societal apprehension. This led to the Red Scare and McCarthy era, whereby communism would be discouraged and suspect communists would be jailed.
If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist.
In 1929, the Wall Street crash had crippled the global economy. However, the USSR survived the economic turmoil due to its adoption of economic isolation beforehand and was rapidly industrializing. This raised some concerns over the expansion of communism under the heat of economic depression. On the 23rd of August, 1939, the USSR and Nazi Germany had signed a non-aggression pact. However, there was a secret clause that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence between Hitler and Stalin. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. On the 17th day of September 1939, Stalin also invaded Poland and annexed 40% of its territory. This triggered the first major geopolitical tensions between the Soviet Union and the West, as Britain had declared a war against Germany based on the preservation of Polish sovereignty. On the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. The Molotov–Ribbentrop Pact was now broken. The German army quickly smashed their way through the plains of Eastern Europe and were heading for Moscow. Stalin was desperate. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. An unlikely alliance formed between capitalist Britain and America and communist Russia against the Axis forces. The Soviet Union had endured the full force of the German war machine and was showing signs of collapse. Between 1941 and 1944, Stalin repeatedly asked for the opening of a second front in Europe to relieve the pressure. The West had delayed this request until 1944. By then, Soviet forces were on the offensive. The indifference shown by the West towards Russia in World War II would shape Stalin's geopolitical goals. In the closing years of the war, the Allies had met at numerous conferences in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam to discuss the future of the post-war world. The United States and the Soviet Union were divided on all matters. Ideologically, Eastern Europe was becoming Sovietized. The United States wanted a liberal and democratic Europe.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
America responded to Sovietism in 1947 by declaring a policy of containment, which would encompass the world.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
The first recipients of U.S. support against communism were Turkey and Greece. Geopolitically, the Soviet Union wanted a buffer zone in Eastern Europe after being invaded through Poland 3 times in 2 decades. Meanwhile, the United States wanted Europe to remain free and independent. They reluctantly agreed to divide Germany into 4 zones and move the Polish border 100 miles west. However, America's refusal to inform Stalin about its nuclear weapons program and its unexpected deployment in Japan raised major geopolitical concerns for the USSR. In response, the Soviets began to build their own nuclear weapons. By 1949, they had tested their first atomic bomb. An arms race had begun. Over the next 50 years, mankind would live under the threat of nuclear annihilation.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive.
Economically, the Soviet Union demanded massive reparations, while the United States adopted a policy of dollar diplomacy by loaning money to Europe, providing the recipients were capitalist and would purchase U.S. goods with the loan. Stalin responded with his own Comecon aid program. In June 1948, the new West Germany currency was introduced. This undermined the economy of the Eastern Zone. Stalin ordered a blockade of Berlin the next day. It was aimed to strangle Western influence in the city. The West responded by orchestrating a 318-day airlift. It was clear the West was determined to hold on to Berlin. The blockade was lifted on the 12th of May, 1949. What followed was the creation of East Germany, West Germany, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact. The Cold War was well underway. After the death of Stalin in 1953, the USSR lessened its iron grip policy and Hungarians were granted limited political freedom. The new Hungarian government demanded Hungary cede from the Warsaw Pact. This was a step over the line for Khrushchev, and Soviet troops invaded on November 1956 to restore control. Between 1945 and 1961, 15% of the East Germany population left to West Germany. These were often highly skilled workers. As a consequence, the economy suffered greatly. On the 12th of August, 1961, East German builders under the protection of the army erected a wall to halt the exodus. The Berlin Wall would become a symbol of ideological division between the East and West.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In 1968, the Czechoslovakian Communist government tried to democratize socialism. The USSR saw this as a threat and, similar to Hungary in 1956, sent Soviet troops to restore control. After a grueling 33-year struggle, the Communists gained power in 1949. The fall of China to communism sent shockwaves across the world. The U.S. believed the rest of Asia would fall to communism. This was called the domino theory. To combat this, it applied the policy of containment to Far East Asia. Brutal and prolonged proxy wars would be fought between the superpowers to preserve and expand their spheres of influence. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 ended in a stalemate, while the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1975 resulted in a swift communist victory. Tensions began to emerge between the Soviet Union and China. In 1956, Khrushchev denounced Stalin's brutal leadership policies. Mao, an admirer of Stalin, saw this as a threat to his own authoritarian leadership, and an ideological showdown between the two Marxist powers ensued. Mao understood the importance of nuclear weapons for geopolitical leverage, but was frustrated at Soviet hesitance to provide assistance to build a bomb. These tensions resulted in both sides engaging in border skirmishes in 1969, and by early 1970, China had turned towards the U.S. for balance against the Soviets. After the death of Mao in 1976, Sino-Soviet tensions continued in the geopolitical realm. Both nations were at odds over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Afghanistan. On January 1, 1959, Fidel Castro had successfully ousted Batista. Communism was now on the shores of the U.S. The Soviet Union saw this as an opportunity to counteract the American missiles in Turkey. The USSR negotiated a deal to place Soviet nuclear weapons on Cuban soil in return for economic aid. Castro agreed. On the 15th of October, 1962, a U.S. reconnaissance plane identified the Soviet missiles. For the next 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war.
The Soviet Union today ordered its armed forces into a state of combat readiness, and forces of the Warsaw Pact, the communist counterpart of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, immediately followed suit.
On the 21st of October, Kennedy announced a naval blockade of Cuba.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
Soviet ships were getting closer. Kennedy placed America's nuclear alertness to Defense Condition 2, one away from nuclear war.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction.
Faced with nuclear escalation, Khrushchev announced on the 28th of October that the missiles would be removed from Cuba in return for the dismantling of U.S. missiles in Turkey. The crisis was over. By 1967, the Arab-Israeli conflict was exacerbated by superpower patronage. The Soviet Union supported Syria and Egypt with aid, military hardware, and political support in return for access to naval facilities to counter the geopolitical monopoly of the U.S. Sixth Fleet. Meanwhile, the U.S. began to veer towards supporting Israel to maintain a strategic foothold in the Middle East. On the 13th of May, 1967, the Soviets provided false intelligence to Egypt of an Israeli military buildup in the east. This was done because of Soviet concerns of the development of an Israeli nuclear reactor. The Arabs would be used to neutralize the threat. In response to the intel, Nasser mobilized Egypt and the Arab world. Israel viewed this Arab mobilization as a threat. It consulted the United States before taking action in order to avoid disputes created by its intervention in the Suez Crisis. America gave the amber light, and Israel attacked. The Arabs were defeated and humiliated. By 1973, the Soviet Union had helped re-equip the Arabs. It provided short- and long-range air defenses to compensate for the weakened Arab air power. This equalized the balance of power and incentivized a war of vengeance. On the 6th of October 1973, the Arabs attacked Israel on Yom Kippur. By the 14th of October, the Israelis were on the counteroffensive. On the 22nd of October, UN Resolution 338 was passed and a ceasefire was declared. Israel ignored this. As a response, Brezhnev threatened to send Soviet troops to Egypt. The U.S. countered by increasing their nuclear alertness to Defense Condition 3, the highest during peacetime. Faced with increasing pressure, Brezhnev halted mobilization. On the 5th of November, 1973, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger began to mediate between the Arabs and Israelis. This was known as shuttle diplomacy. By 1975, military hostilities between Israel and its neighboring Arab states were neutralized. This was a significant geopolitical victory for the United States, as it had managed to steer Sadat toward the American sphere. On the 25th of December 1979, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in order to preserve its influence in the region. The United States responded by providing billions of dollars worth of equipment, including the highly effective Stinger missiles.
That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day.
After suffering huge losses to its air force, the Soviets withdrew in 1989. The period of detente started in 1969 when it was agreed by all sides that the threat of nuclear war was highly probable. The Cold War was temporarily de-escalated as relations between America, China, and the Soviet Union were cooled.
Last Friday in Moscow, we witnessed the beginning of the end of that era, which began in 1945. We took the first step toward a new era of mutually agreed restraint and arms limitation between the two principal nuclear powers.
Issues such as human rights and limiting nuclear weapons were de facto agreed upon. The period of detente quickly came to an end in the early 80s.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Reagan adopted a more confrontational approach to the Cold War.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
He proposed to outspend the Soviet Union in military expenditure, place heavy sanctions on Soviet states, and suggested the U.S. government deploy the Strategic Defense Initiative, a nuclear umbrella that would neutralize Soviet nuclear capability. Although the program was never implemented, it was a radical departure from mutually assured destruction and forced the Soviets to spend more on their nuclear capabilities. In the 1980s, the Soviet system experienced a severe decline in all areas. The inefficient, centrally planned economies, coupled with the astronomical expenditure on defense, resulted in major material shortages across the USSR, while political discontent grew rapidly. After the death of Brezhnev, the Soviets struggled to replace him. In 1985, Gorbachev was appointed as head of the Soviet Union. He sought to revive and restore the Soviet system by introducing perestroika, economic reform, and promoting glasnost, openness, which allowed for the participation of political parties. Political opponents of the Soviet system began to exploit this situation. In 1989, Poland ousted the communist regime and installed their first democratically elected government. Soon, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia would follow suit. That same year, an unprecedented series of mass public protests resulted in the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November. It symbolized the global decline of the USSR. In early 1990, Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. And by August of 1991, he banned the Communist Party, seized its assets, and recognized the independence of the Baltic republics and Ukraine. In response, a group of hardline socialists stormed the residence of Gorbachev to force his resignation and prevent the collapse of the USSR. However, they were met with huge civilian opposition and eventually backed down. On September 1991, the CPD voted for the disillusionment of the USSR. On the 26th of December 1991, the most powerful communist country in history had collapsed.
Compatriots, due to the situation which has evolved as a result of the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, I hereby discontinue my activities at the post of President of the USSR.
The superpower confrontation that might have ended life on Earth was over.
For over 40 years, the United States led the West in the struggle against communism and the threat it posed to our most precious values. This struggle shaped the lives of all Americans. It forced all nations to live under the specter of nuclear destruction. That confrontation is now over.
For more content like this, please like the video, subscribe to Global Frontier, and donate if possible.